The funeral was to have been a private one. It was the word Grace had used on the Wednesday after her father's death when she sat opposite the funeral director, Mr. Hollis, who seemed as if he had carried in his face all the years of other people's deaths. She had said that she was small, intimate. He was a quiet man. He would have wanted something peaceful. Mr. Hollis had nodded and written something down, and she had felt, even at that moment, the peculiar loneliness of planning something for someone who was no longer there to be her yes man. The chapel was booked for 40 persons. The max capacity of the chapel was 40 persons. Not because she was being ungenerous. Grace Mensah was not an ungenerous woman. However, she was realist, and realism was as much a part of her as some things are after decades of practice. 40 seats was not an insult to the small circle of people who loved him, and to her father who was a quiet man and lived a quiet life. It was a true report of it. She had ordered flowers for 40 persons. She had prepared food for 40 persons. She had printed 40 orders of service, each one containing a picture of her father, taken 6 years ago when her brother James was married, but Arthur in a suit that was too big, sitting at a table, smiling with the quiet contentment of a man who knew things well and expressed them with care. Grace had cut him out of the original and put him at the center of something, and, in this peculiar logic of grief, it seemed the appropriate thing to do. On the morning of the funeral, she came to the chapel 40 minutes before the time. She wanted to see if the flowers were in place. The fact that the photograph was properly mounted on the easel. The correct placement of the photograph on the easel. The seating of the order of service on each seat. All this was exactly what it was supposed to be for a guy that had lived his whole life, trying to get everything right by everyone else. There were already people outside. She noticed them as she turned into the car park. A group of figures standing close together, near the entrance to the chapel, in the gray morning light, talking quietly. Initially she thought they were early family. Her cousin Beatrice was always early. The night before her father's sister, Constance, had driven up from Bristol and texted at 7 a.m. stating that she was dressed. She did know the outline of Constance, though. She knew Beatrice. She was familiar with all those present who should be here. She had never met these people. She pulled over and walked toward them slowly, like you walk towards something that you don't yet know how to handle. It was a group of 11 outside, men and women in different ages. The youngest seemed to be about 20, and the oldest a white-haired woman whose dark coat and tidy appearance indicated that she had attended an event of importance. Many of them were already crying. Not dramatically, quietly, like her father had done everything, like grief expresses itself in people who have learnt to feel it without performing it. Grace introduced herself to the nearest person. A man in his 50s in a gray suit, holding a single flower, red at the rim of the eyes. She said that she was the daughter of Arthur. The man studied her with an expression she couldn't decipher. That which was beyond condolence in it. Some kind of unforeseen reverence. "I know," he said. "He spoke about you, and that you had your mother's laugh." Grace absorbed this. "So, how did you know my daddy?" she asked. The man gazed at the entrance to the chapel. Then back at her. "He helped me," he declared. "A long, long time ago, when I had no one to look after me." "Helped you how?" The man smiled, but not evasively, but as one who has something precious he isn't ready to put into words in a car park on a cold morning. Gently, he said, "Today isn't the day for the full story. Today is for him, but I will tell you when you're ready." Grace went inside. There were more inside. No one had ever sat in the front of the chapel on that same seat for 30 years with perfect regularity, and she was in the front of the chapel, looking at these faces that were filling the seats that she didn't know. She counted. Stopped. Started again. Her voice was very controlled as she called her brother James from the car park, and she said without telling them, but she did show them by example, that when things are large, have a very controlled voice. "James, how many people did you tell to?" "Just family." "Why? What's wrong?" "Nothing is wrong exactly." "What is the earliest time at which you can arrive here?" 20 minutes. "Grace, what is happening?" "There are people here. Strangers. A lot of them." A pause in which there were a lot of questions James didn't ask because his sister's voice had communicated in him that she was dealing with something and he had to trust her, not investigate her. "What a large number is." Grace glanced through the doors of the chapel. This time she was careful with her count. "Throughout. Inside and out." She replied, 72. 72 is the number who are not us. Grace was waiting so long for the other end to respond she asked if it was still connected. Then James said in a voice which she had not heard from him since the night her mother died 14 years ago, stripped of everything except the thing underneath, the thing that lived beneath the professional competence and managed the emotion and carefully maintained surface of a functional adult. Who are they, Grace? Well, she replied, I don't know. If not, then we should find out. It took them 3 months. What they discovered during those 3 months would change a man's life that they had been standing beside for all their lives, but never saw completely. It would be the most significant lesson that either of them would ever receive. The person you know the least well is the person who is closest to you. They are not the same as having knowledge, merely being close. Love and understanding are not the same. Arthur Emmanuel Mensah was born on a Thursday in April, the third of 5 children, in a warm, crowded, 2-person household in which 2 had come to England in 1971 with nothing but a dream and a plan to do what it took on a daily basis, and to show up every day, without waiting for anybody's notice or appreciation. His father, Emmanuel, a secondary school mathematics teacher, was patient, accurate, dedicated, and believed that everyone who sat in front of him could learn mathematics. It wasn't a talent one is born with or not. It was a language to be learned. And the person who does learn it is just as capable as the one who doesn't. He had been teaching for 32 years. He was the teacher that was remembered by the old students who sometimes stopped his widow in the street. Like his mother, he had spent 23 years in a hospital laundry, until his knees gave out and he retired to a garden he cultivated with a focused patience. She was still alive at 89, living in a suburb 12 miles off with Arthur's younger sister. And the news of Arthur's death was not brought to her with the same violence as to other parents, but gently. And she had suffered some injury at his death, the nature of which no one spoke positively, but was clear on her face at the funeral. And it was a wound which no one spoke of, but was felt, and yet deeper and more wrong than all other wounds. Arthur had been brought up in the midst of a family that was filled with personality. His older sister Constance had been the bright one, academic madman, good-natured boastful, outwitted her teachers. The kind of sister who made them feel like the superior intellect. Now she was a barrister, and for 30 years she had been to the courts, and she was as ferocious as ever, but more civilized and with a wig. His older brother Edmund had been the outgoing, the one who walked into rooms and made them warmer, the one who told stories people would repeat for years. It had been a gift that Arthur admired but never aspired to, not that he was any the less a gift of the gods. Edmund died at the age of 42 of pancreatic cancer, and his absence had never been fully filled in the family. There was always a space to be careful of at gatherings, a chair that was always a bit noticeable. His younger sisters, twin sisters Acua and Amma, had been the complicated ones. The ones who needed to be taken care of. Those whose lives created the kind of family drama that was ongoing and had a hold on everyone's life and emotional energy. For decades, Arthur was the brother who drove Acua to appointments, and was the one who helped Amma with her business and household affairs, and who picked up the phone when they called at ungodly hours, but never, to the memory of Grace and James, complained about any of it. He met their mother Vera at a church social when he was 27 years old. She had been 25, and a friend had brought her. He had been wanting to introduce her to someone else, but it hadn't worked. But Vera had been sitting for 3 hours in the kitchen of the church hall speaking to Arthur about nothing that the family could recall, and she had driven home thinking about him in a particular way that indicated to her that something was about to happen. They were engaged 2 years later, and then married. The photographs of the wedding were somewhat puzzling. There was a man who seemed to be a little dazed and confused by his happy circumstance, and a woman who appeared to know exactly what she was doing, and seemed pleased about it. Both of these readings were accurate. As adults, they said as people who'd lived in something and had the long view of it, their marriage had been the real thing. Not the enacted model of a good marriage. The actual version. Which meant there had been a time in their late 30s when it had been hard, when they hadn't spoken about it with their children, and when Grace only had an impression of it from the archaeology of their faces, looking at their photos from the time. It had emerged from the hard times with the unique quality of being tested and strengthened. Stronger in the broken places. Something she had always thought was a bit too neat for reality. Vera was dead 14 years before. Cancer diagnosed during a routine screening, treated with intensity, in remission for 18 months, came back in a different form and at a different pace. It was a quiet man in the chair that Arthur had been sitting by her bed for the past few weeks, and the nurses were no longer mentioning him because by now it was just the background noise of that ward. The man in the chair, present at all times, more than several times at all times, talking to his wife quietly. The way one would talk to a woman who has decided that if she can't fix it, she can at least make sure she knows she's not alone in it. So when she passed away, he was sitting in his kitchen at home for a long time, smelling her, and had come up with a list of things that he would have to do. He had done everything mentioned on the list. And he had gone on. When she spoke about her father to those who did not know him, this was a word that she kept repeating. He continued. His wife's death, Edmund's death, his own health scares. A cardiac incident when he was 60, which had caused a lot more fear than it looked like Arthur was encountering. The ups and downs of his children's lives, his sisters' lives, his aging mother's ever-changing needs. He'd been there, steady, always. No one ever asked, what if it wasn't there? The load-bearing wall of a family that had never asked. He had retired from the municipal authority at 64 after 31 years in the records department, which, if he were to explain to someone what it did, he would get the nod of the other person who has no idea that it is an interest, and who would just place the information in a folder he would never open again. His former colleagues had written on a card that was on the mantelpiece at home with the card from the Thursday card group. The most reliable person any of us have ever worked with, and the one we will miss most, though we couldn't have told you that before today. His retirement had been spent gardening and attending the chapel, the Thursday card evenings, visiting his mother twice a week, and when asked, helping his children with the things they needed, which were competent and patient and no particular drama. He was dead at 67. To his family, his life had been a quiet, ordinary, unremarkable one to all intents and purposes. And there were 72 people there besides his own family who were crying at his funeral. He left no record. They kept one for him. James organized the response with the systematic efficiency that was his professional gift and his personal default mode in situations where emotion needed to be managed through action. He was a project manager, had been for 15 years at a construction firm that built things he was genuinely proud of, using skills that were partly trained and partly native. He responded to complexity by creating structure around it. He responded to the unknown by designing a process for making it known. 2 weeks after the funeral, he sat at his kitchen table and composed a letter. He wrote it 12 times before he arrived at a version he was satisfied with. Not because he was indecisive, James was not indecisive, but because the letter needed to do something genuinely difficult. It needed to reach out to 72 strangers about a private matter without making them feel interrogated. It needed to express vulnerability, the admission that a family had not known their own father completely, without performing helplessness. It needed to invite people to share things they may have kept private for reasons that deserved respect. The final version was 3 paragraphs. Our father Arthur Mensah clearly meant something significant to each of you. We did not know you. We did not know what he meant to you, or why you came to say goodbye to him. And we have spent the 2 weeks since the funeral sitting with that not knowing in ways that have been both humbling and difficult. We are not writing to intrude. We understand that whatever passed between you and our father may be private, and we will respect completely any decision not to share it. But if you are willing, if you would like us to know, we would be deeply grateful to hear your story. There are no wrong answers. No story is too small or too large. We are simply trying to know our father more completely than we did. We are trying to meet him, properly, now that he is gone. Please write to us or call or email in whatever form feels right. We will listen to all of it. He had sent 72 letters. He received 68 responses. They read them together. Grace and James at Grace's kitchen table, on 2 consecutive Saturdays in November. Grey London Saturdays with the rain doing what November rain does, which is commit to itself completely and without apology. Grace made tea at the beginning of the first Saturday, and neither of them drank it. The mug sat cooling between them, and neither of them noticed. They read in silence, passing letters across the table when finished. Not commenting as they read. They had agreed to this beforehand. Some mutual understanding that the reading needed to happen without interpretation, that the commentary could come after. The letters were not dramatic. This was the first thing that struck them both, and it struck them simultaneously. Grace looked up at some point during the first hour and found James looking at her, and the look said, "This is not what I expected." And she nodded because it was not what she had expected either. She had braced herself, without admitting she had braced herself, for something sensational. A secret life with large consequences. A revelation that would make Arthur into a stranger. A man who had kept something so significant that knowing it would fundamentally alter the understanding of everything that had preceded it. She had been preparing, she realized, for betrayal. For the specific injury of discovering that the person you trusted most had been managing a version of themselves for your benefit rather than giving you the real thing. What she got instead broke her heart in a completely different and much harder to process direction. The first letter she read was from a woman named Harriet. 61 years old, retired district nurse, grandmother of 4, currently living in the house she had lived in for 30 years in a suburb 8 miles from where Arthur had lived. Harriet had met Arthur 22 years ago, in the car park of a supermarket on a Wednesday afternoon in February. She had locked her keys in her car. It was raining. She had a 4-month-old baby in a pram and a 3-year-old holding her hand, and she had been standing in the car park for 20 minutes when Arthur had pulled into the adjacent space. He had driven her to the nearest locksmith and waited while the locksmith drove them back to the car park and opened it, and then driven her back to the locksmith's to retrieve his own car. The entire process had taken an hour and 40 minutes. She had offered to pay him for his time. He had refused. She had asked for his number so she could send him something. He had given it to her, and she had sent him a card, which he had apparently received because she had had a handwritten note back from him 2 weeks later saying only, "Not necessary at all. I hope the baby is sleeping better." She had kept the note. She had enclosed a photograph of it in her letter. Arthur's handwriting. Precise and even the handwriting of a man who had spent 31 years filling in forms that needed to be legible. "Not necessary at all. I hope the baby is sleeping better. I think about that afternoon still," Harriet wrote. "Not because what he did was extraordinary, though it was, but because of how he did it. He didn't make me feel helped. He made me feel like we were just 2 people solving a practical problem together, and it happened that the problem was mine. I have tried to carry that quality forward in my own life, and I am not sure I have ever fully managed it." The second letter Grace read was from a man named Clifford, 44 years old. Described himself in the first line as someone who had not always made the right choices. A phrase Grace recognized as the careful language of a man who has done specific work on himself and knows how to discuss his past without either minimizing it or dramatizing it. Clifford had met Arthur 7 years ago in the waiting room of a probation office. He had just been released after serving 18 months for a financial crime that he described without detail, only noting that it had cost him his job, his marriage, and most of the relationships in his life that had mattered. He had been sitting in the waiting room with a form he didn't know how to fill in, and the form had mattered because completing it correctly was a condition of his license, and he was not, in that moment, a man who had a lot of room for error. Arthur had been there on an administrative matter, something entirely unrelated, something routine connected to his work. He had sat next to Clifford and looked at the form and had said, "I've seen that form before. The third section is misleading. It looks like it's asking for one thing, but it actually needs something different. Would you like me to show you?" He had shown him. He had also, at the end of the appointment, told Clifford about a free legal advice service 2 streets away that specialized in exactly the kind of situation Clifford was navigating. He had written the address on the back of a receipt he found in his coat pocket. "I went," Clifford wrote. "I got help I would not have known to look for. That helped change the practical course of the next 3 years in ways I can trace directly. I am employed now. I have a relationship with my daughter again. I still have the receipt with the address. I have it in my wallet. I don't know why I keep it. Maybe because it was the first day in a very long time that someone looked at me without the particular look that people had been giving me for 18 months. He just looked at me like a man sitting next to another man who had a form he needed help with." Grace put Clifford's letter down. She looked at the rain on the kitchen window. She picked up the next letter. A woman named Yvonne had written 6 pages in green ink in a handwriting that was large and looping and took up twice the space of Arthur's precise lines. She had been Arthur's neighbor for 9 years, living 3 doors down in a house she had moved into after her husband left, and that she had spent the first 2 years in a state of financial anxiety that she had concealed from everyone around her with what she described as exhausting and ultimately pointless dignity. She had not known Arthur beyond the occasional exchange of greetings until the winter of the 2nd year, when her boiler had broken in January and she had had no money for the repair and no idea who to call, and had been sitting in a cold house for 3 days telling herself she would sort it out tomorrow. Arthur had knocked on her door on the 4th day. He had not said he knew about the boiler. He had not said he had noticed she hadn't opened her windows in days, or that her car hadn't moved. He had said, "I'm going to the hardware shop. I need a part for something. Do you have anything that needs fixing while I'm there?" She had told him about the boiler. He had looked at it, diagnosed it, gone to the hardware shop, returned with a part that cost £11, and repaired it. When she tried to give him the £11, he said he'd already forgotten how much the part had cost. "That winter I kept asking myself why he did it," Yvonne wrote. "I kept looking for the angle, the thing he wanted in return. I had been in a world for 2 years where everything had an angle, where kindness was always transactional, where help always came with a cost I would have to calculate later. And Arthur just didn't. He fixed my boiler and went home, and the next time I saw him he asked if it was still working, and when I said yes he said good, and that was the end of it. I want to tell you something about your father. He saved my life that winter. Not dramatically. Not in the way that makes a story people tell. But I was very close to a kind of collapse that I don't want to be specific about, and the boiler working meant the house was warm, and the house being warm meant I could think, and thinking meant I could begin to see that there was a forward direction available to me. He was one link in a chain that pulled me back. He was not the only link, but he was an important one, and I never told him. I didn't know how. He was so matter-of-fact about it that creating a conversation around it felt like making something out of nothing, and he would have been mortified." James passed a letter across the table without saying anything. Grace looked at it. It was the shortest letter they received. 6 sentences. Written on a piece of lined notebook paper in a young person's handwriting. Uncertain in its line spacing, the letters slightly larger than adult handwriting tends to be. "My name is Marcus. I am 24 years old. I met Mr. Mensah 3 years ago when I was sleeping rough near the high street. He stopped and talked to me every day for 6 weeks. He helped me get into a shelter and then helped me find a room. I have a job now in a warehouse and I am saving up. I don't know what else to say except that I am here, because he stopped." James had left the kitchen. Grace could hear him in the hallway. She read Marcus's letter twice. Then she put it carefully to one side and picked up the next one. There were 68 letters. Some were long and detailed and structured like testimonies. Some were brief and simple and precise. Some had photographs enclosed. Some had photocopies of cards Arthur had sent, his handwriting appearing again and again across 68 letters, always the same, always precise and plain, and without decoration, always saying something that was less than what the situation seemed to warrant, and exactly what the situation actually needed. A man named Winston, who Arthur had sat next to on a train in 2009, when Winston had been in the middle of a panic attack and had not known what was happening to him, and Arthur had recognized it. Had apparently experienced them himself at a point in his life that none of his children had known about, and had talked to him quietly and without drama through the worst of it, and had given him information about a GP service and had checked, once, by text 3 days later, that he had gone. A woman named Sandra, who Arthur had helped navigate the benefits system after her husband's death, spending 3 lunch breaks at the municipal authority, going through her case with a precision that cut through 2 years of bureaucratic error and resulted in a significant back payment she had been owed and had not known how to claim. A retired teacher named Joseph, who had been in the same amateur astronomy club as Arthur for 11 years, which surprised Grace considerably, as she had not known her father had any interest in astronomy, and who wrote that Arthur had been the person in the group who said the least and understood the most, and who I have spent 11 years trying to sit next to because something about his silence made me think more clearly than I did anywhere else. A family, a mother and 2 adult children, who wrote jointly, explaining that Arthur had been present at a car accident 12 years ago involving their father, had stayed at the scene until the ambulance arrived, had held their father's hand and talked to him, and had apparently been the last voice he heard that was not a medical professional. They had found out about Arthur from the paramedics' report, which Grace had not known was information that could be requested, and they had spent 4 years trying to find him to thank him, and had only located him through the funeral notice in a local paper. "We never got to thank him," the mother wrote. "We have thought about that for 4 years. The opportunity has now gone. We came to the funeral because we needed to be in the same room as him one time, even if that time was too late." Grace read that letter and could not continue for a while. James made fresh tea that neither of them drank. They sat at the kitchen table with the rain on the window and 68 letters between them and the full shape of a man they had spent their whole lives standing next to without seeing clearly. He was a records clerk. He understood the value of keeping things. He kept everything except his own account. Grace found the drawer on a Sunday afternoon in December. She had been back to the house several times since the funeral. There was the ongoing work of estate administration, the sorting of belongings, the decisions about what to keep and what to release that every bereaved family faces, and that Grace was approaching with her characteristic methodical care. She had gone through most of the house by this point. The bedroom, the kitchen, the living room with its modest bookshelves and its single comfortable chair positioned at the angle that her father had, over 30 years of sitting in it, established as the optimal angle for reading in that particular light. She had gone through the filing cabinet in the study on the first visit, right after the funeral, looking for important documents. She had found them: insurance policies, property documents, his will, bank statements in labeled folders going back 12 years, a folder containing the children's birth certificates and school records and other documents that parents keep with a thoroughness that their children only discover when it is too late to thank them for it. She had not looked at the bottom drawer, not deliberately avoided it, had simply not gotten to it, had assumed it contained old work documentation, had filed the assumption away and moved on. She was in the study on a December Sunday afternoon returning some books to the shelf when she noticed the lock. Small, brass, the kind of lock that was not dramatic, not a padlock, not a combination lock, not something that announced its own significance. Just a small keyhole in the face of the bottom drawer that indicated it could be locked and currently was. Grace crouched in front of it. She thought about 72 people. She thought about 68 letters. She thought about the phrase that had appeared, in various formulations, in nearly every single letter she had read. He helped me when I had nobody else. She found the key in the third place she looked, a small ceramic dish on her father's dresser, one of those dishes that accumulates the miscellaneous small objects of a daily life. The dish contained 2 buttons, a paper clip, a 2p coin, a receipt from a hardware shop dated 8 months ago, and a small brass key that fit the lock exactly. She opened the drawer. She sat back on her heels. The drawer was full. Not of work documents. Not of anything she had anticipated. Full of cards. Hundreds of them, packed together in the drawer with the organized density of a man who had kept them carefully and run out of space for them to be anything other than dense. Christmas cards. Birthday cards. Thank you cards. Cards with no occasion printed on them that someone had bought blank specifically to write something in. Cards handmade from folded paper and decorated with the particular determined artistry of someone who cannot afford a proper card and makes one instead. Cards so old their edges had softened and their colors had faded toward the pale uniformity of time. Every single one of them was addressed to Arthur. She took them out slowly, in handfuls, and arranged them on the study floor around her. There were more than she could count quickly. She counted later, methodically, sorting them into piles. 247 cards. Spanning what appeared, from the dates she could find, to be approximately 3 decades. She read them. Not all of them that afternoon. There were too many, but she read steadily for 3 hours until the light in the study shifted, and she realized she had been on the floor for longer than she had intended, and her back was telling her about it. Every card said some version of the same thing. Thank you. I don't know what I would have done without you. You changed the direction of something important, and you probably don't know it. I think about what you did, and I cannot find the right words. You probably don't remember me. I remember you every day. Some were from people she recognized from the 68 letters. Many were from people she had never heard of and would never be able to identify. Some were signed with full names. Some with first names only. Some with initials. One, on a piece of paper folded 4 times, was signed with a small drawing of a sun. Arthur had kept every single one. He had kept them in a locked drawer that nobody had been invited to look in. He had kept them and not shown anyone and not mentioned them and not, as far as Grace could establish, used them as the basis for any conversation or any claim of any kind. He had simply kept them. The way you keep things that matter. The way her mother had kept letters. The way the family kept Edmund's photographs. He had kept them because they were given to him by people who meant them, and throwing them away would have been a form of disrespect to the giving of them. But he had not shown them to anyone, because showing them would have made it about him. And it had never been about him. A man's public life is the story he chose to tell. His private life is the story everyone else has been keeping for him. James organized the gathering with the same methodical care he had brought to the letters. It took 6 weeks to arrange. He called it, deliberately, a gathering. Not a memorial, not a celebration of life, not any of the words that come preloaded with expectation. A gathering. People coming together in a room. That was all. Everything else could emerge from the room itself, rather than being imposed upon it. He booked the function room at a community center that turned out. This emerged from 2 of the 68 letters, to have been part funded 11 years ago by a local fundraising effort that Arthur had apparently been involved in organizing without his name appearing anywhere in the official records of it. Of course, 61 of the 72 came. They filled the room with something Grace had not been prepared for. Not the grief of the funeral, which had been the grief of loss, the grief of absence. This was different. This was the energy of people who share something important, and are in the same room as each other for the first time, and are only now discovering that what they share has a community around it. There was recognition without introduction. People who had never met looking at each other, and understanding that they were in the same story, on different pages. Conversations beginning without the usual social preamble, because the usual social preamble was unnecessary when you already knew the essential thing about the person you were talking to. Grace and James stood at the front and said almost nothing. They had agreed on this, that the gathering was not for them to explain or process or claim. It was for them to receive. They had spent their whole lives being close to their father. These 61 people had known something about him that closeness had made invisible. The floor was open from the beginning. Peter spoke first. Peter was 53 years old and spoke in the careful, exact sentences of a man who had rehearsed this account enough times in private that he could deliver it publicly without losing control of it. He had met Arthur at a job center. He had been 41, recently made redundant after 20 years at a plant that had closed, sitting with a form he couldn't fill in and a terror he was not showing. Arthur had sat next to him and offered help with the form. He had spent 40 minutes going through it section by section, explaining not just what to write, but why each section was structured the way it was, and what the people who had read it were actually looking for beneath the phrasing of the questions. He had written his phone number at the top when they finished. Peter had called it twice, with questions about subsequent correspondence from the job center. Arthur had answered both times and known, both times, exactly what the letters were asking and what Peter should do. Peter had gotten a job. "I am a site manager now," he said to the room. "I have been for 11 years. I manage a team of 14 people. I like to think I run a good team. I like to think I am the kind of person who notices when someone next to me has a form they can't fill in." He paused. "I learned that from him. I never told him I learned it from him. I should have. I didn't. I'm telling you now." The room was very quiet. Yvonne spoke about the boiler. She had expanded her letter into a spoken account that was warmer and funnier than the written version. She was a natural speaker, someone who found her words better in the air than on paper, and the room responded to her. The specific kind of laughter that grief produces when it is given permission, the laughter that is also crying and knows it. Winston spoke about the train and the panic attack. He had been sober for 6 years, he said, not directly connected to the train incident, but not disconnected from it either, because the train incident had been the beginning of a period in which he had started paying attention to what was happening inside himself rather than managing it. And Arthur's recognition of what was happening in that train compartment had been the first time Winston had had the experience of being seen accurately and without judgment in the middle of something he was ashamed of. "He didn't make me feel broken," Winston said. "He made me feel like a man who was having a hard moment. There's a difference. It sounds like a small difference. It isn't." Sanders spoke about the benefits system. She had brought documents, the actual correspondence, the corrected assessments, the back payment notification, not to present as evidence, but because she had been carrying them for years, and the carrying of them had been a form of keeping Arthur present, and she wanted the room to see what the practical outcome of a man spending 3 lunch breaks on someone else's problem had looked like in material terms. The room looked at the documents. The room was quiet in a particular way. And then a woman Grace had not seen before stood up at the back of the room. She was in her early 40s, professionally dressed, composed in the way of someone who is prepared for this moment and is drawing on that preparation fully. Her name was Rachel. She had not been at the funeral. She had heard about the gathering from someone who had a chain of connection that had reached her 3 weeks ago and that she had sat with for 3 weeks before deciding to come. "I did not know Mr. Mensah," she said. "I never met him. I am here because of something that happened to my mother 8 years ago. My mother was in hospital. She was alone. I was overseas at the time, and she had no one nearby, and she was frightened in the way that people are frightened in hospitals when they are alone. She told me about a man who came to visit someone else on her ward, and who, on his way out, stopped and talked to her for 20 minutes. Who came back the next day, on his way to visit his person again, and talked to her again. Who did this for 4 days in a row until I was able to get back. My mother described him. I have spent 8 years thinking about how to find him. When I read the gathering notice, I knew. She described his quietness. The way he asked questions and listened to the answers completely. The way he didn't look at his watch. My mother died 2 years ago. She talked about those 4 days in hospital for 2 years. She said the man who stopped and talked to her was the reason she was not afraid to die, because he had shown her that kindness existed in the world in its pure form, without motive, without agenda, and if that existed, then the world was fundamentally good, and she could leave it without fear. She never knew his name. I found out tonight. I wanted to come and say it out loud in a room where people would understand why it mattered. His name was Arthur. The room was completely silent. Grace was holding James's hand. She did not know when she had taken it. The best inheritance is not money. It is an example so clear that you spend the rest of your life trying to live up to it. Grace changed jobs 4 months after the gathering. She had been in corporate communications for 11 years. She was good at it, genuinely good at it, the kind of good that comes from aptitude and sustained effort, and that generates a career of increasing responsibility and compensation. She had not been unhappy exactly. She found the word finally, after the gathering, after 68 letters, after Rachel's account of a woman who died without fear because a man had stopped. She had been insufficient. Doing work that used a portion of her capacity and left the rest undeployed. She took a position at a community legal advice center. The pay was significantly lower. The hours were unpredictable. The problems she spent her days on were real in the specific way of problems that have faces and consequences, and that cannot be managed with a good presentation and a clear narrative framework. She came home tired in a way that was completely different from any tired she had experienced in 11 years of corporate communications. The tired had weight to it. Substance. The tired of someone who has spent themselves on something that actually needed spending. She told James over the phone on the evening of her first week. He was quiet for a moment. He would have said nothing, James said, and looked very pleased. I know, Grace said. I know exactly what he would have done. James did not change jobs. This was not complacency. James examined the question seriously and honestly, with the rigor he brought to structural decisions, and concluded that he was already, more than he had realized, his father's son. Had been doing small, unremarkable, unannounced things for people in his orbit for years. Not as a strategy, not as a program, but as a reflex that he had never named or examined or recognized as significant. He thought about the person who had shown him that reflex and understood, for the first time, where it had come from. He used what he had more deliberately after that. More consciously. Not differently. The quality of it didn't change, couldn't be manufactured. But with the awareness that it mattered. That the person next to you on a train or in a waiting room or at a car park in February is carrying something you cannot see and may need something you have. The Arthur Mensah Fund launched 7 months after the funeral. Deliberately small. Deliberately quiet. Arthur would have been deeply uncomfortable with anything that announced itself, and both his children understood this without discussing it. They had designed it consciously in his image. Its purpose was practical assistance with bureaucratic navigation. The specific thing that Arthur had done for Clifford in a probation waiting room, for Peter in a job center, for Sandra with the benefits correspondence. The systems that were supposed to help people and that frequently failed to do so not because of malice but because of complexity. Forms that were misleading, processes that required knowledge the people who needed them most were least likely to have, rights that existed but were invisible without someone to point at them. The fund employed 2 people. Both of them had responded to the letter James had sent. Both of them had their own Arthur story. At the inaugural meeting, Grace stood at the front of a small room and said one thing. She said, "My father kept no record of any of this. He was a records clerk for 31 years. He kept meticulous records of everything in his professional life and everything in his domestic life. And he kept no record at all of the people in this room or what he did for them. Not because he had forgotten. I think he kept no record because a record implies accounting. And he was not interested in accounting. He was interested in the next person who needed the form explained." She paused. "We're going to try to do what he did. And we're going to try to do it the way he did it, which means that the moment we start counting what we give is the moment we have misunderstood what we are doing here. We give it, we forget we gave it, and we look for the next thing. Peter started the applause. The room followed. He would have been mortified by all of this. They have decided this means they are doing it exactly right. A year and 3 months after the funeral, a letter arrived at Grace's home address. She did not know how the sender had found her address. She did not look into it. Some things arrived by routes that didn't require investigation. The letter was handwritten. A name she didn't recognize on the back of the envelope. A town 200 miles north. Dear Grace, my name is Francis Osei. I am 56 years old, and I live in a town your father probably never visited. I did not know him well. I met him once, very briefly, at a train station 12 years ago. I was sitting on a platform bench. I will not describe the full context of why I was sitting there or what state I was in, because the details are mine, and they are not necessary for what I want to tell you. What is necessary is that I was at a particular kind of ending, and I did not know at that moment whether I had the will to find a beginning. Your father sat down next to me on the bench. He did not ask if I was all right. He seemed to understand that was not the right question. He sat for a while in silence, and then he said, "Whatever it is not the end." And then he said, "I know that sounds like something someone says, but I mean it specifically. Whatever this particular thing is, it is not the end of everything." And then his train came, and he got up and he got on it. He did not leave his name. He did not ask for mine. He was on the platform for perhaps 8 minutes in total. I have thought about those 6 words for 12 years. Whatever it is not the end. I read about the gathering in something a friend sent me. One of the 61 had written something online about it, briefly, and my friend thought I should see it. I knew immediately. The description of him. The quality of the silence before he spoke. The train. I would have come to the gathering if I had known. I am writing instead, which feels inadequate, but it is what I have. I want you to know that I am here. That I have been here, building a life, for 12 years, and that those 6 words were part of the reason I was able to start building it. Not the whole reason. I had to do the work myself, and I did, and I am proud of that work. But he put something in me on that platform that I needed at that exact moment, and that I have carried every day since. I am the 73rd. Please tell people about him. Not because he was extraordinary, though he was, but because he was also completely ordinary, and that is the point, isn't it? He was a records clerk who drove the same car for 11 years. He was a quiet man with a quiet life. And he chose, every single day, without record or recognition or reward, to pay attention to the person next to him. We can all do that. We can all be that. Whatever it is not the end. With love and gratitude. Francis. Grace read the letter twice at the kitchen table. She sat with it for a long time. Then she got out a piece of paper. Proper paper, the kind her father had kept in the second drawer of his desk, slightly heavier than standard, the kind that took ink well. And she picked up a pen and she wrote back. A proper letter. By hand. She told Francis about the gathering. About the 68 letters. About the drawer and the 247 cards. About Rachel and the woman who died without fear. About the fund and what it was doing. About what Grace had understood, finally, about her father. That he had not been keeping himself from them. Had not been hidden or secretive or withholding. Had simply understood, at a level so deep it was below conscious thought, that goodness performed is a different thing from goodness done, and that the difference lives precisely in the absence of the audience. She told Francis that she was glad she had written. She told her that the letter would go in a folder that Grace was keeping. Not a locked drawer, not a hidden place, but a plain manila folder in a plain filing cabinet, and that she would read it again when she needed to remember why the fund existed and what it was for. She told her that her father would have been mortified by all of it, by the gathering and the letters and the fund and the folder, that he would have performed the dismissive hand gesture and changed the subject. She told Francis that she had decided this meant they were doing everything exactly right. She sealed the envelope. She put it in her bag to post in the morning. She sat in the kitchen in the quiet of her house and thought about a man who had driven the same car for 11 years and worn quiet clothes and kept quiet company and spent 31 years in a records department and had said almost nothing in rooms full of people and had kept 247 cards in a locked drawer and had sat next to a woman on a platform bench and said 6 words that she had carried for 12 years. She thought about the 72, the 73, the ones they would never find, the ones whose names were not in the drawer. The ones who had not seen the funeral notice. The ones who were out there somewhere, carrying something her father had given them, not knowing that the man who gave it was gone, not knowing that there were 72 others, not knowing that in a quiet house in London his daughter was sitting at a kitchen table thinking about all the ways a quiet, ordinary, unremarkable man could change the shape of the world by simply paying attention to the person next to him. She thought, we will never know the full number. She thought, that is exactly how he would have wanted it. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to bed. She slept well for the first time in months. If Arthur's story did something to you, if the drawer got you, if the 73 got you, if those 6 words landed somewhere they were supposed to land, drop the word 73 in the comments right now. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Do not miss what comes next.